Most people recognize this experience. A conversation ends, and the moment seems finished. The discussion is over, the other person has moved on, and attention shifts towards something else. But sometime later, the mind quietly returns to the interaction. A sentence that was spoken earlier begins replaying. The brain remembers the tone of voice, the timing of the reply, or the expression on someone's face. The moment unfolds again inside the mind. Sometimes the replay happens minutes later. Sometimes it appears hours afterward, long after the conversation itself has ended. This pattern is surprisingly common. Psychologists have spent many years studying why the brain revisits social interactions in this way. The replay does not occur randomly. Instead, it reflects how the mind analyzes communication and social meaning. Even after a conversation is finished in the real world, the brain may continue examining what was said and how it was understood. Conversations are complex events for the brain. During even a short interaction, the mind must process many different signals at once. Words are interpreted, tone of voice is evaluated, and facial expressions are observed. At the same time, the brain prepares responses and monitors how the conversation is unfolding. These processes occur quickly, often within seconds. Because the exchange moves so rapidly, the brain does not always have enough time to fully analyze every part of the interaction while it is happening. Instead, some of that analysis continues afterward. Once the conversation ends and attention is no longer divided between listening and speaking, the mind gains the opportunity to review what occurred. Details that were only briefly noticed during the moment can now be examined more carefully. This delayed analysis is one reason conversations sometimes replay inside the mind after they have already finished. The brain is especially sensitive to social meaning. Human beings rely heavily on communication to maintain relationships, solve disagreements, and exchange ideas with others. Because of this importance, the mind devotes considerable attention to interpreting how conversations unfold. When a discussion contains uncertainty or emotional tension, the brain may mark the interaction as something worth reviewing later. Perhaps a comment seemed unclear. Perhaps a reaction from the other person was difficult to interpret. Even subtle signals can create questions in the mind. Did the tone sound dismissive? Did the explanation come across the way it was intended? These small uncertainties can remain active in memory. Later, when the brain returns to the conversation, it examines these moments again. The replay becomes part of the mind's effort to understand the meaning behind the interaction. Another reason conversations replay is connected to how memory organizes social experiences. The brain stores interactions not only as words, but also as patterns of meaning. During a conversation, the mind gathers information about how ideas were received and how responses influenced the direction of the discussion. After the interaction ends, the brain may continue arranging this information. It compares different parts of the conversation, noticing how one statement led to another. Through this process, the mind builds a clearer picture of how the exchange unfolded. A sentence spoken earlier might appear different when viewed alongside a reaction that occurred later in the discussion. These connections can become visible only after the moment has passed. The replay allows the brain to reorganize the interaction and examine how the pieces of the conversation fit together. Another reason conversations replay is that the brain often continues evaluating how clearly ideas were communicated. During discussions, people usually speak while simultaneously thinking about what to say next. This overlap between listening and responding leaves limited time for reflection. Because of this, the mind may not immediately notice how certain statements were interpreted. After the conversation ends, however, the brain returns to the interaction and reviews how the exchange unfolded. It considers whether a particular explanation sounded confusing or whether a comment might have been misunderstood. These reflections are not necessarily deliberate. They occur as the brain quietly examines how communication worked during the moment. By replaying the conversation, the mind gains a second opportunity to observe the interaction from a distance. This distance often reveals patterns that were not obvious while the discussion was still taking place. Emotional signals can also influence how strongly a conversation remains in the mind. When a discussion carries emotional weight, the brain tends to remember it more vividly. A remark that felt surprising, frustrating, or meaningful may become especially noticeable during the interaction. Because emotional reactions attract attention, the brain often marks those moments as significant. Later, when the mind begins reviewing the conversation, these emotionally charged parts of the discussion are usually the first to appear. The brain replays the tone of the comment, the pause before a reply, or the expression on someone's face. Through this replay, the mind attempts to understand what those emotional signals meant within the context of the conversation. The stronger the emotional meaning attached to a moment, the more likely the brain is to revisit it during reflection. Memory connections also contribute to why conversations return to attention after they have ended. The brain organizes experiences by linking them to other related events. A conversation about a particular topic may activate memories of earlier discussions or past disagreements involving similar ideas. When the mind begins replaying a recent conversation, these connections can bring other memories into awareness. A sentence spoken during the interaction may remind the brain of a similar statement heard in another context. As these connections appear, the mind compares the different experiences. The brain observes how people responded in each situation and how the discussions developed. Through this process, the replay becomes part of a larger effort to understand patterns in communication. Each conversation contributes new information to this network of social experience. Another factor behind conversational replay is the brain's natural preference for completeness. Human thinking tends to return to situations that feel unfinished. If a conversation ends abruptly or leaves certain ideas unresolved, the mind may continue examining the interaction afterward. The brain searches for a clearer understanding of how the discussion reached its conclusion. It revisits the sequence of statements, observing how each comment influenced the direction of the exchange. Through this review, the mind attempts to form a more complete interpretation of the conversation. Even small uncertainties can trigger this process. A brief pause in the discussion or an ambiguous remark may create questions that remain open. The replay allows the brain to revisit these moments and explore how the interaction might be interpreted. Another reason conversations replay in the mind is related to how the brain monitors social understanding. During interactions, people constantly interpret what others might be thinking or feeling. This process happens quickly and often without conscious awareness. The brain attempts to estimate whether an idea was understood correctly or whether a statement may have been interpreted differently than intended. Because these interpretations occur rapidly, the mind may not have time to evaluate them fully during the conversation itself. After the interaction ends, the brain may return to these moments to examine them more carefully. The replay allows the mind to reconsider how certain statements might have sounded from the other person's perspective. A comment that seemed straightforward earlier may appear more complex when viewed again later. By reviewing the exchange, the brain continues refining its understanding of how communication was perceived during the interaction. Language itself can also contribute to why conversations replay. During discussions, people often express ideas while those ideas are still forming. Words may capture only part of the thought that exists internally. The explanation might feel slightly incomplete, even while it is being spoken. Once the conversation ends, the brain continues organizing the idea that was expressed. The mind adjusts wording, clarifies meaning, and reshapes the structure of the explanation. Through this process, the thought gradually becomes more precise. When the brain revisits the conversation later, it may compare the original sentence with the clearer version that has formed during reflection. This difference can make the earlier statement feel unfinished. The replay allows the mind to observe how the original expression differed from the refined idea that appeared afterward. Attention also changes significantly once a conversation ends. During the interaction, attention is divided between many tasks at the same time. The brain listens to words, observes reactions, and prepares responses simultaneously. Because attention is spread across these different activities, only a portion of the mind's resources can focus on analyzing the discussion. After the conversation finishes, that division of attention disappears. The brain is no longer required to monitor facial expressions or prepare immediate replies. With fewer signals competing for attention, the mind can concentrate on the memory of the conversation itself. This shift in attention allows the brain to examine the interaction in greater detail. The replay becomes an opportunity for the mind to study the conversation without the distractions that were present during the original moment. There is also a difference between experiencing a conversation and observing it afterward. During the interaction, a person is actively participating in the discussion. Attention remains focused on responding and keeping the exchange moving forward. When the brain replays the conversation later, the perspective changes. The mind now observes the interaction almost as if watching it from outside. This shift allows the brain to notice patterns that were less visible during the moment itself. The sequence of statements may appear clearer, and the structure of the discussion becomes easier to follow. By reviewing the interaction in this way, the mind gains a broader view of how the conversation developed. The replay transforms the experience from participation into observation, allowing the brain to analyze the discussion with greater clarity. Another feature of conversational replay is how the brain gradually organizes meaning after the interaction ends. During a discussion, the mind often processes information in small fragments. A sentence is heard, a reaction is interpreted, and attention quickly moves to the next moment of the exchange. Because of this rapid movement, the full meaning of certain statements may not become clear right away. After the conversation is over, the brain begins reviewing those fragments more carefully. The mind places the earlier comments alongside the reactions that followed them and begins arranging the sequence into a clearer structure. Ideas that once seemed separate now appear connected. A sentence spoken early in the conversation may take on new significance when viewed in relation to a response that came later. As these connections form, the brain builds a more complete understanding of how the interaction unfolded. Another reason conversations replay is the brain's natural interest in understanding intention. Communication rarely involves only the literal meaning of words. People also attempt to interpret the purpose behind what was said. Tone, emphasis, and timing all provide clues about how a message might have been intended. During a conversation, the brain interprets these signals quickly, often making immediate assumptions about meaning. Later, when the mind revisits the interaction, those assumptions may be reconsidered. The brain may explore whether the original interpretation was accurate. A statement that initially sounded dismissive might appear more neutral when examined again. Through this reflective process, the mind experiments with different interpretations of the same moment. The replay allows the brain to compare these possibilities and refine its understanding of the other person's intentions. Social learning is another reason the brain returns to past conversations. Every interaction provides information about how communication works between people. The mind observes how certain explanations are received and how different responses influence the direction of a discussion. When the brain replays a conversation, it often compares the interaction with other similar experiences stored in memory. A disagreement may remind the mind of an earlier discussion where a similar idea appeared. By comparing these events, the brain gathers patterns about how conversations develop. Over time, these patterns help the mind predict how future interactions might unfold. The replay, therefore, becomes part of a broader learning process. The brain studies the conversation not only to understand what happened, but also to refine how it interprets communication in general. Perspective also changes once a conversation becomes a memory. During the interaction, attention remains focused on the immediate flow of dialogue. The brain reacts moment by moment as new statements appear. Afterward, the mind can observe the entire conversation as a complete sequence. This wider perspective makes certain patterns easier to notice. The brain may recognize how one comment shifted the tone of the discussion, or how a particular response influenced what happened next. Seeing the conversation as a full sequence allows the mind to understand the structure of the interaction more clearly. This broader view often emerges only after the moment has passed. The replay therefore gives the brain the opportunity to examine the conversation from a perspective that was not available while it was happening. Another reason conversations replay in the mind is the brain's tendency to simulate possible interpretations of social events. Human communication rarely follows a single clear meaning. The same sentence can be understood in several different ways depending on tone, context, or the relationship between the people involved. During the conversation itself, the brain often selects one interpretation quickly so the discussion can continue. Later, when the interaction is revisited in memory, the mind may explore other possible meanings. The brain asks quiet questions during this process. Did the other person intend the comment as criticism, or was it simply an observation? Was the reaction a sign of disagreement, or was it unrelated to the conversation? By considering these alternative interpretations, the mind attempts to refine its understanding of the interaction. The replay allows the brain to test these possibilities without the pressure of responding immediately. Imagined variations of the conversation can also appear during this reflective process. Once the brain begins reviewing the interaction, it may construct slightly different versions of how the discussion might have continued. In these imagined moments, the conversation unfolds a little further. The mind may picture another sentence being spoken, or imagine how the other person might have responded if a different explanation had been given. These simulations help the brain explore how the interaction might have developed under different circumstances. The purpose of this process is not to rewrite the past. Instead, the brain is examining how small changes in communication can influence the direction of a conversation. By exploring these variations, the mind gathers information about how ideas might be expressed more clearly in similar situations. Another reason conversations replay is that communication is central to how people understand one another. Through conversation, individuals exchange ideas, negotiate disagreements, and establish shared understanding. Because these interactions shape relationships and social dynamics, the brain treats them as important events. When an interaction includes uncertainty or emotional significance, the mind may continue examining it afterward. The replay allows the brain to observe how the conversation influenced the relationship between the people involved. A brief remark may carry meaning beyond the words themselves. By revisiting the interaction, the mind attempts to interpret how the exchange affected the broader social context. Each replay adds another layer to the brain's understanding of how communication functions within relationships. The environment in which the replay occurs also influences how the conversation appears in memory. These reflections often take place during quiet moments when the mind is not occupied with immediate tasks. Activities such as walking, driving, or resting provide space for thoughts to move more freely. Without new information demanding attention, the brain naturally turns toward reviewing recent experiences. Conversations are especially likely to appear during these periods because they involve complex layers of meaning. As the mind revisits the interaction, it can focus entirely on examining what was said and how it was interpreted. The absence of distraction allows the replay to unfold with greater clarity. In this calm mental environment, the brain can observe the conversation in detail and consider the different ways the interaction might be understood. From a psychological perspective, conversational replay reveals how actively the brain studies social communication. Human interactions contain many subtle signals that must be interpreted quickly. Words, tone, pauses, and reactions all contribute to how a message is understood. Because these signals appear simultaneously, the brain may not analyze each one fully during the conversation itself. After the interaction ends, the mind often continues working with the information it gathered. The replay becomes a form of reflection, where the brain reorganizes what happened during the exchange. By reviewing the interaction, the mind refines its understanding of how communication unfolded. Each replay adds another layer of insight about how ideas were expressed and interpreted within the discussion. When viewed from a distance, the replaying of conversations becomes easier to understand. It is not simply the mind repeating events without purpose. Instead, it reflects the brain's effort to interpret and organize social experience. Conversations move quickly and often contain layers of meaning that cannot be fully examined in the moment. Once the interaction ends, the brain gains the opportunity to revisit the exchange and explore it in greater detail. Through this process, the mind compares interpretations, considers alternative meanings, and connects the conversation to other experiences. The replay, therefore, becomes part of the brain's ongoing effort to understand how communication works. What appears as a repeated memory is often the mind quietly studying how people speak, respond, and attempt to understand one another.